one of the biggest mistakes that people do is really their wall and their familiars and their heroes. See, a lot of people don't really understand how to go ahead and go about this. They'll usually do like the 10% familiars in here, and what I mean by 10% familiars are familiars like the stacking familiars. You know, you gotta lose 10% of your troops for it to actually even do anything. You have like Tailwind, you gotta lose 10% of your troops. So a lot of these familiars, unless you've lost already quite a bit of troops, aren't even gonna do anything for you. But you do have these familiars like Savage Breath that only takes 4% of your troops. So that's a lot better, unless you have just so many troops, like 50, 100 million, something like that. These 4% familiars are actually pretty decent. But outside of that, you might want to actually go with familiars that'll proc right at the beginning of the battle, like Hearty Feast, like Drown Out, just because they're guaranteed to actually help you during a battle, whereas like Whirlwind, you might get rallied, take out the whole rally, and this never helped you at all. So it's something to keep in mind. When your familiar needs 8%, 10% to proc, it's probably not a great defensive familiar. Could be great offensive, because obviously offensive, you're probably going to lose 10% of your troops fairly fast. But defensively is a whole nother animal. So you got to make sure that you set up your familiars with that in mind. Like, for instance, if you have 40 million troops, you need to lose 4 million troops before these familiars even do anything. Do you really want to have your familiars start helping you after you've lost 4 million troops? Probably not. You probably want to help. You probably want some help beforehand, right? So just something to think about. Familiars and heroes, please. Free to play. If you are free to play, oh man, I can't take out Berserker. But okay, Berserker. Let's just say that Berserker is Rose Knight, because Rose Knight is the best free to play hero. I mean, I don't think there's much argument there. Rose Knight is just really good. There is another army hero that you can use, and that is going to be Bomb and Goblin. Army anything, if you're free to play, is going to be really, really strong. So Bomb and Goblin, even though he only really brings that army attack, it's going to be invaluable. And then from there, what I would recommend is you kind of mix and match. So you can go Child of Light, Cavalry, Attack, HP. You can go Demon Slayer. You get the same, but infantry. And then you can also go Snow Queen. So essentially what you're doing, and we're just pretending that Berserker is Rose Knight. Don't forget Rose Knight. So let's say if you're free to play, you can go Rose Knight, Child of Light, Snow Queen, Demon Slayer, Bomb and Goblin, and you'll have 2 army heroes, and then you'll have 3 heroes for each troop type that'll give you the best boost that you can get, that being attack and HP. So if you're free to play, this is what you want to go for with your lineup. Now, of course, this can change depending on if, like, for instance, if you're a trap and you're going to always take it in an infantry front, then maybe you might want to add an extra army hero instead of, like, your range. So just something to keep in mind. Oathkeeper, Demon Slayer, Bomb and Goblin, Snow Queen. Yeah, that's fine. I mean, you got to remember, Demon Slayer gives you infantry attack and HP, and Oathkeeper also gives you the same. So whether you use Oathkeeper or Demon Slayer, it doesn't matter. The boost is going to be the same. The reason I say Demon Slayer, though, is because if you have to choose between one to take up first, Demon Slayer will always be the answer, because not only is Demon Slayer better for Colosseum, which will help you get some gems as free to play, he's also much better for hunting monsters, which you're also going to need that extra boost as free to play. So Demon Slayer will always take priority over Oathkeeper. But if you're to the point that you have both maxed out, then either or, it doesn't really matter. But just something to keep in mind. What phalanx to use to take multiple rallies and less T4 death? Okay, if you're going to be taking multiple rallies, the only phalanx that I would not recommend is anything cavalry related. Don't ever take multiple rallies at once in any sort of cavalry formation, just because one range rally can cripple you. Having cavalry up front is the worst thing that you can do, especially if you don't know what's coming, because if there's a range rally coming at you, cavalry tends to run in front of your army, so you'll have basically just your cavalry troops against their ranged troops for a good, man, like 15-20 seconds of the battle, and you do not want that, because that just means that you're going to lose millions of troops before the rest of your army gets there. So stay away from any sort of cavalry formation. The rest, I would definitely suggest, but here's what I would say. If you're going to be taking a rally and you know what's coming and you have time to switch, I would suggest a phalanx. Like, for instance, if you see that a cavalry rally is coming, then range phalanx will be the go-to. Now, if it's going to be multiple rallies, 3, 4 rallies, etc., and you just do not know what's coming, I would suggest a wedge. Because a wedge will provide you more defense if you are countered to your front line, for instance. So just something to keep in mind. Range wedge is a fairly safe one, because if it's going to be range on range, it's not going to be too bad. And if it's going to be like an infantry rally, your cavalry is going to be on the infantry fairly fast, so it's not going to be too bad. And then, of course, if it's cavalry, it's going straight into your range. So range wedge is usually the universal best one, but infantry phalanx is also really good. Just stay away from cavalry. I'm telling you, it's just, unless you know for a fact an infantry rally is coming, stay away from cavalry formations. Just don't do it. Don't do it. Range wedge isn't the best. I mean, no phalanx or wedge is the best. It depends what's coming at you. You can make a case with anything that it's not the best, because it depends what they're sending. Obviously, if they're sending a bunch of infantry at you, you might want to take it in a cav formation, or even in an infantry wedge. If it's like a two infantry rallies, but you have a couple more rallies coming that you can't check what they are, infantry wedge would probably be the best answer. But again, there is no best formation. That's great that you mentioned that range wedge isn't the best. You're right. There is no best. There's literally no best, because it depends what's coming at you. There is no best. 15% familiars are better than stacking familiars? What are 15% familiars? Oh, you're talking about the attacking ones, right? You're talking about like these. If you have 20 million troops, again, that depends on who's rallying you. If it's somebody that can take down 2 million troops fairly fast, like if we're talking like a big boy, then maybe you can think about maybe like a 10% familiar, etc. But these familiars, the infantry attack 15%, range attack 15%, etc., they're actually really good in general, because they're going to proc right at the beginning of the battle. So if you have all of the attack familiars, infantry, range, cav, 15%, and then you also have the HP familiars like the Acquirus and Evil Weevil, that means that you're going to have 5 familiars that are going to proc right at the beginning of the battle. So that's a big boost. That's a big boost, instead of waiting to lose 10% of your troops to get that help. So something to think about. Is Pyrus Familiar the worst buff when taking rallies? I wouldn't say it's the worst buff, but it's not very good. Like on paper, this sounds great. You know, at the start of the battle, grants a 60% boost to heroes' tactics skills, increasing squad attack damage as damage dealt to troops for 10 seconds. Now, if you don't know what any of that means, right? A 16% boost to heroes' tactics skills basically means a 60% boost to their squad attack. So here it is, tactics. Deals 200% squad attack as damage to enemy troops. Now, that 200% is actually really solid when you get it off, because that's probably the most damaging attack that you're going to get during your whole attack. So getting that up to 260% is really good. The problem with all of that, though, is that right there, at the start of battle, and it's only for 10 seconds. So that means that if you're being rallied, this is going to proc right at the start, which is great, but it only lasts for 10 seconds. So at the beginning of the battle, if this goes off, remember, your troops still have to reach each other. So by the time anybody starts fighting, 5-6 seconds have already gone. So this really only affects you for 4 or 3 seconds. Is that worth it? Probably not. Probably not. So I would never suggest this familiar in any battle, just because for at least half of the duration of this familiar's effect, you're not going to be fighting anything. So yeah, if it was one of those familiars that would proc, like once they start fighting, for instance, it would be much better. It would be much more used. But since it starts right at the start, and you still have to reach each other to fight, that's a good 5-6 seconds before anything happens. It loses a lot of its effect. So that's the big downside there. But here's what I was talking about earlier, right? You guys know that nowadays, even if you take a rally and you counter it, you're gonna take some reds because of the T5 familiars. So deal 600% damage based on your initial ranged attack, and then of course you have the infantry and cav one, to the largest enemy squads when 4% of your troops have fallen. So this means that you're gonna take some damage regardless. If they're using this familiars, you're gonna be taking damage. So what I was thinking is, you know how a lot of people they stack T2. Let's say you have 10 million each T2, and then you have, I don't know, what's the usual number? 1 or 2 million each T4. So this familiar, it's going to go ahead and hit you no matter what. So I was thinking, if this familiar is always going to be hitting the largest squad, and I believe this goes for the same one, like the 150%, right here, deals 150% damage every 4 seconds for up to 5 times to one of the largest enemy squads. So if you're going to be taking a blast attack, they're going to be using these two familiars. So that means that your largest squad is always going to be targeted. So let's say that you're an infantry phalanx and you have 10 million T2 infantry, you have 10 million T2 cavalry, and then you have 15 million ranged T2. Your front line is going to be infantry, but the familiar damage is actually going to go to the ranged, because that's going to be your largest squad. That's the one that you have the largest number of troops. So the actual rally is going to be hitting your infantry, but the familiar is going to be hitting your range. So technically speaking, they're going to be hitting two front lines, because the rally hits the infantry, the familiars are going to hit the ranged. But if that's the case, couldn't you manipulate that to hit siege? And what I mean by that is, let's say that you're going to be taking, I don't know, let's say a cav rally. You can go ahead and switch to range. That way you're going to be countering it. But if siege, let's say you build up to like 16 million T1 siege, not only is the cavalry going to be countered completely to your range, the familiar should technically be hitting your T1 siege. So that means that you can keep switching front lines and take rallies without necessarily taking a huge huge damage to your front line, or the one that you have the most of, because siege is always going to be in the back. So they'd have to hit quite a few rallies for the siege to keep taking away that familiar damage. So if you have 10 million T2 infantry, 10 million T2 cav, 10 million T2 range, but 15 million siege, that means that familiar damage should always be hitting your siege, which is really interesting. And it's going to be T1, so the damage is going to be not very much. So it's quite an interesting one. So something that I was kind of keeping in mind, like, you can go ahead and build T2 infantry cav in range, but always keep like your T1 siege the highest you have, and that means that your damage is going to be mitigated, especially that familiar damage, because it's always going to be hitting T1. So really something to keep in mind. And also, because you have T1 siege, instead of it being like T1 infantry or cav or range, you don't have to worry about switching your front line, because your front line will always be T2, and your T1 siege will always stay in the back. So it's something that I kind of want to play around with and actually see about how that's gonna work out. But it's something that I really think that people will probably start doing in the future, because that T5 familiar damage a lot of times is most of the damage that a rally does. So yeah, that T5 will drop morale on your T1 siege and you burn. No, because remember, T1 siege will always be in the back. They will never touch your T1 siege. The only thing that will touch your T1 siege is the familiar damage. That's it. So yeah, no matter how you change your formation, the siege always stays in the back. If you notice, the siege will always stay in the back. So whatever you have as your front line is going to take the actual rally damage, and then the T1 siege will take the familiar damage. So you're kind of splitting the damage in two, and that means that your T2 will survive longer because the familiar damage is going to your T1. But T1 siege will fill the rest of your infirmary and sanctuary. But that if it fills your infirmaries and your sanctuary, you probably did something wrong, because it shouldn't kill that much. You know what I mean? Your T1 siege will drop morale from the T5 familiars nowhere near as much as you would, as much as they would need to actually win and burn you. You need to, like, for T1, for you to burn from T1 losses, you would need to take millions and millions of damage. And if it's only from the familiar, you're not going to take anywhere near as much. And even if you do take, I don't know, like 1.5 million, T1 is so easy to build back up. Like, literally, it's so easy that even if you lose 1 million, 2 million T1 siege, it's nowhere near as much as losing your T2. And even then, T2 is fairly easy to rebuild. So